Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I actually live here part of the time, so it's like being at home, except there's no rain today. I don't know what that's about, but I had a lovely ride over the bridge. The commuter traffic for bicycles is improving, but I had a lot of bells ringing behind me all the time, and the look that they give you when they whiz past you, these other riders, I mean, it's unconscionable. It's bad enough that I'm getting superseded by these people, but they give you this kind of disgusting look, like, why are you on the road? There's a sidewalk over there. Why don't you just walk your bike? It's getting kind of competitive. But it's still a pleasure to be back here. You'll notice that behind me, I don't know if you can see the first slide. There will be no slides. I know this group. And I've done this before and prepared slides and just had everyone looking at their laptops. So rather than me do a show for you, just work on your own show. Look at the show beside you, those of you who didn't bring your laptops. And I'll try to give you enough references. In fact, yes, why don't you do that? Some of you can kind of, those of you who aren't Twittering this presentation, the rest of you can kind of call up some of the sites and locations and references that I make. So that you can do the visuals for the locals around you. And we can crowdsource the PowerPoint presentation and then publish it afterwards and do a Creative Commons license on it, and we'll just be fine. I want to explain to you today a few things, and I want to try to bring you up to date because it's very hard to stay up to date in this whole area of open education, open source, open access, open data. And the truth is that I'm working on another project. I just started to tell John Hilton for a moment here. I'm working on a project on monasteries. And I just said the whole energy just went down. Medieval monasteries and the origins of intellectual property. But I keep getting interrupted. I keep being disturbed by new developments, by court decisions. Really rock-shaking, earth-shattering court decisions from Canada and the United States. I keep seeing the ground under my feet around intellectual property changing in such exciting ways that I have to put down my quill pen, set aside my vellum, ask my illuminators to hold off for a short period of time while I set the monastic project aside. But I do want to establish at some point the origins of this whole concept. Why in the world would we expect education to be open? We take it for granted, not the rest of the world does not. And so I think it's important for us to think about these assumptions. But I'm not going to do that now. I think we also have to stay on top of things. And I want to speak in terms of beyond open content or beyond the open content theme around the sense of we're open for what? And in particular around this theme of intellectual property. Because I don't technically work in open education. My classes are closed. I don't broadcast them. I'm not a MOOCer yet, at this point at least. And I work in the small confines of seminar rooms and lecture theaters like this. But I'm on the other side, and I've kind of missed the boat a bit. I hope I don't sound too resentful in terms of all the sensational attention that's being paid now to open education. Your ship has come in. Not just at 4:30, but I mean really. You better return to that Bob Dylan song, When Your Ship Comes In, and the words they use for it to get you confused. Although that, do you remember that song? That ship has come in. I'm on the other side. I'm on the access to knowledge. I'm on the public library side. If you're on the open school side, my work has been on the library side, on the public library. Because when I was a kid, and I was walking to school in Brantford, Ontario, in St. Catharines, Ontario, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. We were the little transient as a family. When I was walking to school, and I had to go past the public library, it was very, very tempting. I don't know about the rest of you. If you had a choice between heading to school and heading to the public library, the school, yes, I can see you all saying that. I can read your lips. School, man, 9 o'clock, yes, I'm there. But some of us would look forward to that library opportunity. And when we were in school, we'd say, oh, I think there's a really important book in the library. And when I was a teacher in the school, any excuse to take the students to the library. And so on the library side of this open question, I've been working on what's called open access. It's not the best term in the world, but it kind of comes out of the open source movement. And in fact, the project I've been working on, the Public Knowledge Project, located at Simon Fraser University, the Public Knowledge Project is on the side of that public library and has been concerned with what we can do to make the research and scholarship of the university, my primary responsibility, available to open education, available to public libraries, and available to the world. And we have been quietly working, not that quietly, since I knew Paul at least, and actually shortly after the telelearning project, for a decade or so, minding our own business. Each year a few more journals are sharing their research and literature. Each year a few more professors are making sure that their papers, the work they've done in their communities or on their research subject, is available freely. And then, man, did we get scooped last year when a couple of professors at Stanford launched an open course and it attracted 150,000 students. This is a university that has been debating for years whether to add 100 more undergraduate students. It just picked up 150,000 students. I'm still kind of stunned. The professor, Sebastian, No. Yeah. He quit. He resigned from the university at the end of the course. I think that's, I don't know what to think, actually. Like, I just taught so well. I just have to stop. You know, I think that's just like I can't, what more can I do? I've got to start something else. And he started Udacity. A couple other of my colleagues, Andrew Ng and Daphne Mallet. No, that's a Canadian author. Daphne Cole. Good, thank you. Have started Coursera, a platform. It started in January. They now have $16 million of venture capital behind this project. We don't know exactly what's happening here. I have to tell you one thing, though. I wear this tie now at Stanford. I didn't wear a tie at UBC. I wear a tie at Stanford so you can tell that I'm not a venture capitalist. I don't want people coming up to me and asking. I don't wear a t-shirt or a hoodie, as you can imagine why. So let me talk to you a bit about this open access movement, because I want to tie it very directly to your responsibilities, to your interests in open education. I want to try once again to bring the two things together. And I want to conclude with a killer app that I came up with this morning that's going to make us all richer beyond our wildest dreams for bringing the two together. My work is involving open source software, bringing open source software to open access. We create platforms that are freely distributed for publishing journals and now publishing books, monographs, and scholarly editions that we hope will be made freely available for students, for members of public libraries, for the public in general. We hope, because one of the first lessons I learned, again, not resentfully, but a little bit of chagrin, one of the first lessons I learned with open source software, you already know all of this, is you can't dictate the terms under which it is used. You cannot take your shoe off and pound the table and say everything that uses this software will be made free. It was a hard lesson to learn. It's one that I owe to Rolly, in fact, who works just around the corner from here in the Publishing Studies, Center for Publishing Studies, Center for the Study of Publishing Studies at SFU. But we have now over 14,000 installations of our software, and we have done surveys, and close to 90% of the journals that use our software make their research free. And half of those journals are in developing countries. And so what it has done, it is, I would want to claim, immodestly, forgive me, it's not part of my monastic background, pride and vanity, two of the great sins. I want to boast that it changes the balance. It changes the dynamics of a global knowledge exchange, when there may be 6, 7, 8,000 journals in the developing world sharing their work in a way that Google Scholar picks up just as well as it picks up the New England Journal of Medicine. I want to suggest through this talk ways in which we can work together to increase that global knowledge exchange, to see how the dynamics by which we share knowledge can be changed. And when I say open for what, I'm hoping that open education will be open for more than the learning of the individual students who are enrolled. I want to encourage a sensibility that says learning is a service to others, and that the best learning, the most fulfilling learning, is the learning that you communicate to others and see in their eyes that it has been shared, as I'm doing right now, except for those of you who are twittering this part of the talk. So what this has led to is a whole community of scholar and student publishers who have turned their back on the large corporate entities that control scholarly publishing and have taken the journals, and I hope soon the books, back into their own hands. And what they have done is they have created a community, a do-it-yourself publishing enterprise based on small journals distributed across a wide variety of fields in ways that increase academic freedom because they can start new topics, new fields of research on a dime, even less than that. And so this sense then in which knowledge is being produced within the academy already needs to become part of the open education framework. And that if I had any criticism of online learning is its insularity and self-containedness. And the MOOCs are the worst examples, so I'll come to that in a few moments. Our partners in this operation should be no surprise. Our principal partners are the libraries of this world. Have I got librarians in the audience? Yes. I'm in love with librarians, what can I say? The lady of the library. So, if we are going to forge this partnership, if we are going to take advantage, and let me just say for a moment that libraries have been with us at every step of the way. Libraries are hosting these independent scholar-student journals. Libraries are places we can turn to share our knowledge, including the knowledge produced by our students in open education courses. And so if learning is going to be a service for others, if our students are going to begin to see the value of their learning in what it does for others, we need a place to host. We need a place that will preserve. We need a place that will help us think about the organization and indexing. And guess who the best people on earth are for that? It starts with L and ends with librarian. I used to teach school. Never so well behaved. Open access today. So what is the state of open access? I've been working on open access. The term itself is from 2001, but I started in 1998. When I found I was really embarrassed, we tried to do a thing with the Vancouver Sun. The Vancouver Sun ran a series of articles, and we were going to put the research behind those articles in 1998. It was a great experiment. John Cruikshank was the editor at the time. David Radler was the owner. Is he out now? Okay. At any rate, it was a wonderful experiment, but we were totally embarrassed. We were shamefacedly confronted by the fact that the newspaper was willing to run articles on computers in schools, and we couldn't share the research behind that. We could share the abstracts only. And I had no idea. I had been working as a professor at that point probably for a decade or so, and it just had never occurred to me that we weren't allowed to share our research with the public. And that kind of turned me. I at that point said, whoa, I've got to clean up my own backyard. I've got a real problem here in terms of my responsibility. So how far have I come in all that time? 21% of all the literature, all the research and scholarship published, I know some of you are shaking your heads. Are you kidding? 12, 14 years, and you're saying 21% of the literature is freely available at this point? You couldn't do any better than that? That's what my mother says. 21% of the literature is available no matter where it's published. Someone is taking an article that they published and they're posting it online, legally, with the permission of the publisher, as long as it's the final draft, not yet copy edited or badly laid out without any margins and hard to read long line lengths. And so the responsibility actually isn't the publishers. Elsevier and Springer and Taylor and Francis and those huge forces that run scholarly publishing have given permission to faculty members to put up their final drafts, some of them with kind of embargo periods, but we haven't taken advantage of it. In Canada, there has been action taken. The CIHR, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, now has a requirement, a legal requirement. If you accept money, taxpayers' money, to do research in health, not in education, heaven forbid, but in health, within 6 months you need to make your publication freely available. In PubMed Canada, we're still only at 20% of the literature. In the United States, the National Institutes of Health has a similar law in place. In fact, it preceded the CIHR. And we still only have 21% of the literature. But it is going up every year. A second phenomenon that we need to take account in terms of thinking about where is the state of access to this knowledge is the megajournal. There is a new phenomena afoot, the megajournal. The megajournal crossing the stage, big whale. Have anyone got a Leviathan? Is anyone doing Leviathan shots here? Big whale. The megajournal is the first new concept in journal publishing, I would say, in the digital age. The brilliant idea behind the megajournal is, how much more does it cost to publish an extra article? In terms of production costs, almost nothing. In terms of print limitations, in terms of the traditional postage and mailing and wrapping. And so we have now a journal called PLOS One, the Public Library of Science One, that will publish, that did, actually not, by the end of this year we'll have 14,000 articles. Can you see how this is a new idea? In print this wouldn't work. You know, the PLOS One just arrived today. It's in the driveway. Bring the front end loader around, we'll get it in the house. 14,000 articles, but what's more serious about it than just the overwhelming size is they're peer-reviewed. This is going to be my first public announcement of this. I have been rejected by PLOS One. Not just me alone, but I won't name the other co-conspirators. Of course, it was just a test to see if they were really doing peer review. And they really are doing peer review. We got really good reviews back. And the editor said no. So we have the 14,001 best and one best article this year. But it was still more than one too many. So this is a new concept. This means that everything that passes peer review can be published almost immediately. That research is not something that needs to compete for the top journal and then for the next journal and then for the next journal until it finally finds a home, as my journals typically do, among the carp at the bottom. That we have a concept in which the circulation of knowledge is something that is not about gatekeeping in terms of that hierarchy, but has a minimal competency, has a contribution to make that readers, the public, these are all open access articles. And it's catching on. Nature is running a mega journal. The Royal Society of London is running. Now it's on vellum. But it's still a mega journal. No. We owe a great tribute because the Royal Society was the first publisher of journals in 1662. So it's kind of nice to see them coming around. Authors are paying fees for this. So it's $1,350 to publish in the PLOS One, and I was willing to pay. I sent them one of those check, I took a photograph of my check and I sent it along to kind of encourage the reviewers. We still got rejected. They wanted to see the back of the check, whether it had been endorsed or not. And so we have a new economics coming into place that authors should pay. And many people are upset about this. But I like the idea. I think it needs to be scaled. Some publishers, Wiley Blackwell, so well named, Wiley Blackwell, Springer, Elsevier are all charging $3,000 article processing fees. Ridiculous amounts. But the principle is important because these publishers are providing a service. They shouldn't be owning the intellectual property. And so we're seeing changes afoot in the way that knowledge is circulating. And I think there is no more important responsibility in educating people for today's world than introducing the concept of intellectual property. Introducing them to the principles of intellectual property by which you live as content creators, as teachers and educators, and the principles of intellectual property by which they are receiving and paying for materials, and intellectual property principles by which their children are ripping and burning their cultural content. Because this economy is driven by intellectual property. Because we are in an intellectual property age, and we're not teaching about it. Not in our elementary schools, where students are sharing files, not in our high schools, where students are creating their own videos and circulating them, and not in our universities. And we are sending our students defenseless or criminally equipped into a world. And we have done that in a way that seems to me irresponsibly. And so I want to consider how we can make greater connections around this. And one of the ways we can think about that in terms of intellectual property is at the data level. Let me deal with the open data for a moment. I've talked about open source software, and I've talked a bit about open access. You represent open education. Open data is another piece of this puzzle. Open data is potentially the most exciting in terms of the principles of science, the philosophy of science. Open data refers to the concept, the very basic principle of the replication of research. Unless you're open with your data, how can you begin to replicate? How can you begin to test and have others test the work that you've done? The very famous experiment, Isaac Newton published only one in his life. And I repeat that often, perhaps too often, but it's a point of pride, because I've got Newton beat on that measure. I think some of you probably do as well. He only published one article, and he was driven somewhat crazy, given his temperament, by the number of letters inquiring about how he conducted. This is very famous with the prism, and he cut a little slit in the blind, and he had the light come through, and it refracts, and it breaks up into colors, and he established that white light is made up of multiple colors. Do you know that experiment? You've probably done that many times in your own home. Your children have, perhaps. And so people kept writing in, I've sliced every blind in my house, I don't know how big the slice is supposed to be, I've taken apart the chandelier, it's not working for me, I've been kicked out of my own home already. And so Newton very reluctantly provided the data, provided some precision. This is in about 1672, when the Royal Society had there's one in France, Journal des Savants, but there was only 2 journals at that time, so Newton was kind of confined in terms of his choices where to publish. So this idea of sharing the data, I want to just give you a couple of examples, but I want you to think in this context that if open data is the way forward, how can our students begin to participate in that? I want to come to a conclusion that challenges you to think about your students, to think about the students involved in open education contributing to open data. Because the important thing about access to research and to scholarship and to data, the important thing is the expectations of the public. We will open as it is expected. We will meet the challenge of sharing what we know as the public expects it. And until we can raise those expectations, we will be fighting, as I have been, as many of us have been, an uphill battle. 21% is a reflection of the public's expectations. We won't get to 50% of the research and scholarship being made freely available until the public expects more. So let me give you a couple examples in terms of open data. The Genome Project is the best example, GenBank. So all of the work in genetics that is published today, all of that data is made available in a federally funded library database called GenBank. And the journals have got together, all of the journals that publish genetic research, from the very famous New England Journal of Medicine to the very tiny, obscure Genetics Today, which I just made up. It's the very obscure part. All of them have a requirement. They will not publish the article unless the data is shared. And that took huge maneuvering by the National Library of Medicine, huge conspiring, huge resistance from the biologists, some biologists to be fair, to share the data. But it has now become the norm, and it is the only, slightly qualified, it is one of the few fields in which the sharing of the data is required, for publication. And again, the idea that federally financed data, the idea that we have to create fresh data for every experiment. Think about the public expense of that, of always having to create fresh data and never having that data reanalyzed, and all of the cloning and other kinds of scandals in terms of biomedical research that have come about because the data wasn't available and somebody only discovered that the data had been falsified by very careful examination of the figures and tables and calculations that had been made. One of the breakthroughs that happened at UBC a few weeks ago in terms of sharing data is the university's Institutional Review Board for Research granted permission to Mary Bryson in a project on cancer research to share her videos of subjects online. So we think of genetics as kind of harmless in terms of anonymity of the individual and in terms of privacy and all of those things. But Mary Bryson argued vociferously, if you know Mary argued vociferously that what these people, what these cancer patients were sharing with her had tremendous value for the public, and that these patients were willing, in fact committed, to sharing the knowledge they had acquired through this process. And that right of the participant, of the research subject, to share what they know in a video, in a direct voice, as it were, and personality, an individual, was an important element. And the review board's standard position was absolutely, are you kidding? Not. Because of the privacy. But at some point they realized that the social value, they realized that the public good that would be done by this research by sharing this data. So the open data is full of complexities. The open data movement is full of concerns about database structure, about how do you reuse that data, how do you classify it, how do you establish that it is somehow susceptible to reanalysis. All of those technical issues, how do you label fields, all of the ethical issues. But we need to begin to think about this. We need to begin to raise our expectations. And if we have our students beginning to generate data in their communities for the value of that community, if we begin to talk to them about the intellectual property that is rooted in public funding, that they are in a position to slap a Creative Commons license on and begin to share, then we've made a huge step forward in terms of this concept of openness in education and openness in research and all of the other areas of openness. I want to share one more example from last week's newspaper. I told you things are breaking. I want to get to the court cases. But this is from, it's like this, right? Have you seen one of these? This is, I don't know if you're familiar with this. Let me give you the, goes like this. And here, I didn't charge it, sorry. Oh, wait, no, I have connectivity. So this is Glaxo. This is the pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceuticals are kind of the bad boys in many of these data questions. But Glaxo has decided that it will start opening its data on its clinical trials. I don't know if you know the story about clinical trials in pharmaceuticals. Good results, publish it. Bad results, what study? What are you talking about? So Glaxo, here's the paragraph. Glaxo is taking the step of sharing its data after experimenting with disclosure for treatments for tropical diseases like malaria and finding those efforts to share that data successful, according to company officials. They found that sharing the data on malaria was successful. The company official said. I frankly don't know what that means. Does that mean their sales went up because they shared the data? What does it mean to be successful in sharing the data? What it should mean is that other people were able to develop generic drugs at 1/10 of the cost for people who suffer from malaria who could not afford Glaxo's drugs in the very best of circumstances. But that Glaxo has found a way, this by the way is in light of a suit against them I mean, we can put terrible spin on it, and I should be fair, because some of you may own stock, and certainly your pension probably owns stock in Glaxo, as probably mine does. But this concept is just beginning to take hold. And this idea that the public has yet to, that Glaxo should be leading and the public should be following is misdirected, to my mind. That we should be the ones, and our students should be the ones, that are saying, unless you have some very good reason that more people shouldn't know about how to treat malaria, we want to know why that data isn't available. We want to know why you would want to hide that data, and we are very curious about what was successful about your sharing of data. Let me deal with the courts. Let me deal with what's most exciting and most recent. In August and last week, there have been two very, very important court decisions. Actually, let me bring in three very important court decisions on the side of educators, on the question of fair dealing. Paul was very kind to announce that the fair dealing talk this afternoon was canceled. That was a setup for my talk about fair dealing. He thought he would build anticipation, and I thought I could just step into the breach and talk a bit about it, because fair dealing has changed in Canada. Fair dealing is now far more on the side of educators. Fair dealing is something that we want, again, the public, our students, to know about, but we want to take advantage of. So Judge Arbella, in the summer, in a ruling on the province of Alberta against access copyright, won a case. And what was most important in that case was how it redefined the classroom. How it redefined the relationship between the teacher and the student. Fair dealing in Canada, and fair use in the United States, which I also want to talk about very briefly, fair dealing in Canada has at its very core a sense of respect for education, for learning. Education is kind of in a question mark. Let me call it learning. There's no question about learning. Fair dealing in Canada says private study is exempt from the traditional regime of copyright. What does that mean? It means if you go into a public library, here I am again, I was on my way to school. If you go into the public library, the librarian has no problem copying an article for you. You have no problem copying an article because that's for private study. And so the government, in its wisdom, said that value of you learning is such that we can suspend this law. This monopoly has been granted to the publisher and to the author, and we can suspend that for at least the time it takes for that individual to learn, because that individual's learning will contribute to the good of society at least equal to the publisher and the author. And so that respect was always fundamental to fair dealing and fair use. Private study. But it caused a problem for the classroom. Because the classroom was kind of debatable about private study. When I taught school, and the principal walked by my classroom, there was no mistake in his mind that it was private study going on there, because he would tell me, it's way too noisy in that classroom for anyone to think, let alone engage in private study. Now, he wasn't concerned about intellectual property or copyright or anything like that. He had other issues. But the important principle was, is the classroom a place of private study? And Judge Arbella this summer said yes. That the student's engagement with the work, even if a teacher is standing at the front of the room, or a guide on the side. Sorry, did I say front of the room? Excuse me. So last year. A guide on the side. That the student is engaged in a form of individual or private study. And that was a radical. That had never been declared. That shifted everything. That meant that the classroom all of a sudden was under the cone of protection of learning in terms of intellectual property that we could begin to think about. Now, it's more complicated than that, but it was at least the starting step to say that what the teacher and the student are engaged in is ultimately an individual and private act of learning. And so the importance of that was established. Now, there are technicalities that should prevent you from running out and photocopying everything you can and sharing it in your classroom. And part of those technicalities had to do with the amount that was copied. And part of the technicalities had to do with the availability of replacing those photocopies with the actual texts themselves. The publishers, with Canada Access Copyright representing the publishers said that every time a teacher copies a small excerpt, the school should buy the textbook that it came from. And the judge thought, well, that was kind of ridiculous, and I think it is too, given the school's budgets. But the school had bought textbooks, and so the judge's decision was that, in fact, they had already participated and shown good faith and bought the original textbook, and these were only supplements. So it gets technical, but the basic decision was so fundamental. The judge also threw out, the Supreme Court also threw out the publisher's concern that this photocopying that was doing, these are supplementary excerpts that help the students' learning in addition to the textbook that they have. The publisher said this was hurting textbook sales. Textbook sales were going down, were declining, and they blamed the teachers for excerpting additional materials. I mean, it's just so anti-educational. It just gives me the kind of the willies that the teachers were violating some law when they were finding additional materials to help the students' learning. The judge threw it out. The judge said there's no proof there. And underneath that, I kind of felt, yes, textbook sales are declining because teachers are using a much wider variety of materials today. Because teachers have the entire world of resources. With each internet drop, as we used to say, in the schools, but now with Wi-Fi. And that students are facing a much broader world of learning than is contained and packaged in the textbook. Let me give you a couple other court decisions that bear on this. Actually, the new copyright bills, let me finish the Canadian section. So Canada has a new copyright bill. And in that copyright bill, under fair dealing, education is now stated explicitly. Previously, there was reference to learning, private study. Educational purpose was referred to, but education as a domain was not. And so now we have within fair dealing, yet to be defined, still very vaguely established, and I need to give you the exception on this, we now have education as grounds for an argument. But unfortunately, one of the other grounds against fair dealing is an established business practice. And that is, if there is an existing or established business practice, take the textbook industry, then photocopying in a way that would defeat the sales, if it could be established directly, in which the school had no textbooks, is not a non-starter. So we still have the business industry, if you like, the publishing industry still has that trump card. And all due respect, our goal here is not to put the publishing industry out of business. Our goal here is to be equal players at the table. Our goal here is to put learning first and to see the publishing industry as a service. So in terms of this fair dealing, what we're seeing is an equalization, is a recognition of the contribution of learning, is a sense of participation. And Access Copyright, and again, I receive a check from Access Copyright, well into, at least twice, 3 figures. I've been a professor for 20 years. I don't think that's undeserved. But I'm ready to give that back. Because the idea that my research needs to be remunerated after my salary and after the glory of presenting it to groups like this, after all of the rewards and the perks, it seems to me silly. And that students are being asked to pay, and now institutions are being asked to pay. And I hope you've been following that Simon Fraser University, First University of British Columbia, and Simon Fraser University have said no to Access Copyright in terms of the agreement, the current terms of the agreement to cover photocopying for students. And part of the reason for them saying no is that everything is up in the air right now. Part of the reason for saying no is they will not pay a fixed per-student fee because, we did a study, in fact, 40% of the material course readers are freely available in the library. 40% of the materials that students were being asked to pay 17 cents a page for, 40% of those materials could be found in the library. And the important element there is they were losing the skills of finding things in the libraries by turning through the course reader. And the students said to us, I like the course reader. Each paper is in order of the class. And we thought, oh, okay, that's good. They're able to count, they can follow, they're great skills. This is good. No, the educational argument here is overwhelming in favor of course readers. So we want to think again about how intellectual property is being treated. What are the opportunities to introduce the intellectual property issues to our students? Why can't we talk to them about the cost for course readers or e-readers or e-reserves against notions of finding that 21% of the literature that's free, the resources that are in their libraries? Let me take one more aspect in terms of the two court cases in the States. I should very briefly, just last week, the Hathia Trust at the University of Michigan won a ruling against the Authors Guild. The Authors Guild sued. It has Hathia Trust at Michigan has all of the texts that Google has scanned and was making them available for visually impaired people and was making them available as an index that you could search but could not see any of the text, but you could tell how many times John Locke was available in a particular text. And they were sued, and they won the case. And again, the judge said that this fell within fair use, that making it available for the visually impaired was a transformative use. And again, these are very technical and not well-decided terms, but that there was yet another decision. At Georgia State, the courts decided in favor of the university's use of e-reserves. They were sued by Cambridge and Oxford and by the Copyright Clearinghouse, and that case was kind of a joke in a way, because when the judge asked to see proof that the publishers actually owned the material, in about 80% of the cases, the publishers couldn't find the documents that established the author had turned over copyright. So that's kind of a farcical one. But the judges also recognized that the educational setting was a firm ground for a case to be made, and that the publishers had not done enough, and this is a kind of scary aspect, had not done enough to create an alternative business model. That is, they had not made it easy to get permissions. And so I know the publishers are going to respond by having a credit card set up that's very easy to get permissions, and the Copyright Clearinghouse in the United States does do a fairly good job of that. So we have the courts beginning to consider these issues. And the courts will respond to public expectations, not immediately and not always accurately. But again, it speaks to this need. Let me close with a section on needs and opportunities. Let me start with this question of what can we be open to, what it is we need to do. I have been stressing all along, the first thing we need to do is raise expectations among ourselves and among our students and among the public for intellectual property rights. We need to raise expectations that learning is a different kind of enterprise than publishing software with Google, or that running an advertising site, publishing software like Microsoft, running an advertising site like Google. And we need to inform people about their rights. As creators, our students, as intellectual property creators, maybe that's the most important thing you could do, is have students recognize that they are intellectual property creators and that they have a right to put a license, a Creative Commons license, on their work, and set that within the context of sharing their learning as a service to others. And the examples I would give, the examples that seem to me to lead the way but are far too complicated, are Galaxy Zoo and Foldit. Are you familiar with Galaxy Zoo? 200,000 people are identifying different galaxies, the shapes, the form of these galaxies. This data set, this massive, astronomically large. I just thought of that pun right now. Astronomically large data set. 200,000 people are taking a few moments every day and matching the types. They've even discovered a new type, one that no one could classify, one that now has a new name called green pea or something very similar to that, because the galaxy structure was quite different than any that anyone had identified before, among the astronomers, no less. Fold It is a different kind of game. Fold It is an educational game where you fold proteins. That part of the work in terms of genetics is an understanding of how proteins fold and how they can be treated around their molecular structure. And so they have a game structure where you get points for correctly folding the proteins. Now, they had a machine analysis for this. They had algorithms that would do it through computational processes, and they found that humans were better. Yes. And so they encourage people to do it. And you start with platypus venom. This is the first protein that you start as a beginner to fold. And I think, to me, that would be like introduce a class, a biology class to, we're going to be folding the proteins of platypus venom. I think and the students would be like, can I take it home? Can I use it on my sister? All these sort of things that they might come up with. But the sense then that protein folding is an important contribution to biomedical research, because part of the treatment's based on the structure and all these things, and the folding is quite complicated with many parameters and factors, is another element. But those are very difficult to develop. And the University of Washington has a center now devoted to developing games where people contribute. I think, in terms of the killer apps, this is the big part, this is the payoff part of the, let me introduce a few ways that each of us can make a contribution. They don't need to be open source, your contributions. I'm hoping they will be. But again, you could be a great donor to open source if you were to monetize your particular app. The first one is, we need very simple kinds of applications for learning where we apply our lessons to our communities. If it's a statistics course, if it's a public health course, if it's an education course, we need to develop not a formula, but a way in which teachers can readily see and share the projects of our students, so that they conduct some form of educational application for their community. Where are the public libraries in our communities? Well, there's a website for that. But there may be resources in those libraries that your students could make more publicly available. There may be elements in terms of meetings or events that they could help the library communicate, in terms of a media course or communications course. That they can look for services that their learning and skills can provide to the community. And what we need for that, for educators, for teachers, is we need a structure for that. We need to be able to share and bring together, to classify, to host that knowledge so it provides an organized form, so that each student can see from the previous student, oh man, is that all they did? They thought that was helpful? I'll show them helpful. And they can build on those applications in that way. So ways in which the learning that our students are engaged in open education, remains open. And is something that others can profit from, even if they're not signed up. And so that the line between that choice that I made as a child to go to school, let's be honest, to go to school instead of going to the public library is no longer a line, a divide. That the learning that I was doing in school is very much a part of, contributes to, constitutes the public library of my community, the public knowledge of my community. Now let me take it one step further in terms of killer apps here. This is the MOOC problem. The thing about the MOOC, I know. I was at a meeting even yesterday it was coming up. The thing about the MOOC is this insularity. What I mean by that is the professor is doing videos. The talking head, some of them are very animated. But that's an effect they add afterwards. One professor, Devlin, who's teaching a math one, I forgot his first, maybe Richard. Devlin is teaching a math one, and he does, and what's most amazing and most educational about this is not that the students, so he has 40,000 students, he's losing a few thousand students a week. I love that. He's not even worried. If I lost a few thousand students a week, I'd be really worried. I'd be like phoning. But he's not worried about that part. But what is interesting is that the students are going on and doing the assignments, getting 100%, and he's got kind of a nice distribution. But he's finding that there's a whole group of students who are criticizing the assignments, who are coming on and engaging in this critique of the design of the assignments. That was the only time I said, yes, that is a powerful form of education. And he's now taken to doing 3 or 4 or 5-minute videos each week. Not defensive, but explaining in more detail, as Newton did in 1672, why his assignments were well designed. And so that kind of engagement is interesting, but it's still all that insularity. The students do not pick up a text from anywhere else. It's all within the course. There aren't even windows to see the other world of knowledge outside the course. How can we build an app that will bring that 21% of the literature that is free into engagement? How do we begin to connect open education with this larger world of knowledge that I and many other people are working so darn hard to make available to you? How do we begin to bring that together? The first step would be Google Scholar. Now you may say, and many do, Google Scholar is not the library, it's a business. But Google Scholar has been working hard with us and other organizations to level the playing field, so that those journals in developing countries are on the same page, not at the same level, but on the same page when it comes to malaria as the New England Journal of Medicine, which publishes very few articles on malaria. And so this idea of how we bring Google Scholar into the world of open education, how we help students identify. Do you know how to identify? Are you calling up Google Scholar right now? Get Google Scholar up on those screens right now. Does that young woman have Google Scholar on her screen right now? Could you look over on the shoulder? Could you check over at the back? You got Google? All right, put in Google Scholar, put in anything you're interested in, and see if you can identify which are the open access articles. Because we need a way to do that. And then we need a way of helping other students see which articles are best for their field. We need a way of rating and ranking those articles. We need to have our students engaged in the selection and determination of learning and coming together to appreciate and analyze those research articles. Because 21% of those articles, it's more. That 21% was 2009. What am I talking about? 23.5% of those articles are freely available. Are people able to see which ones are freely available? Beside the title, it says umc.ca.edu.pdf. You see there's a little tag on the right-hand side with PDF at the end of it, .pdf. That's probably freely available. But Google is playing many sides of the game, and it has to respect the publisher's copy, so it's not saying, here's the free copy, but we could. We could build scripts that would identify the free copy. We could begin to build a way for students to rank and rate the relevance. We could put in each week the keywords that would help them find and identify the readings for that week, and then we could ask the students, what have they found and what do they think is valuable? They could vote up the readings they felt were valuable. And you would have a whole series of readings that were crowdsourced and assessed and peer-reviewed, because everybody in your class is a peer. And they could peer-review those readings to their relevance and what they learned from them. And they could isolate the parts of the readings that were really important. I don't know how many times students have told me, I didn't need to read the whole thing. Well, you too? And you? Yeah. I know, I'm kind of embarrassed about that 400-page book, and you're like, oh, sorry. The idea that students could begin to provide their own annotation and commentary, their own critique, and to build that body of knowledge that we would keep closed and confined within our... No! That we would open and share for other students. Because the courses you're teaching or involved in creating are courses that are taught in many, many different locations. And that would build an expectation and an awareness. So when our students graduated from our courses, what would they know? They would know exactly where the entire world of publicly available knowledge is. And their expectations for that knowledge, especially if you play on the 23.5 and announce to them when it reaches 25%, fully 1/4 of all the literature freely available, which will be in 17 months, I hope. They will begin to have those expectations. And so when the federal government says, well, we're requiring in Canada that all of the health research is freely available. And they would say, well, does that mean that the education of my children doesn't matter? That the legal system isn't worth considering critically? That the social welfare system, that the support for culture and arts in this country, Stephen Harper, isn't worth considering in terms of the research that's been done on it? We can begin raising those expectations. So if anyone in the audience is willing to take the challenge, is willing to start to think through this killer app that is so missing from the MOOCs. Did I mention the $16 million that Coursera has available? Now remember, I'm wearing a tie. I'm not a venture capitalist. I'm not wearing a hoodie. I don't start companies. But I am willing to talk to you. I am willing to work with you. I am willing to think through what it would take to bring open education in a way that opens it. Open to what? Open to all of the knowledge in the world. Thank you very much.